Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're joined by Nathan Gonzales, the publisher and editor of Inside Elections, and an election analyst for CQ Roll Call. Nathan's made the rounds as an analyst over the course of his career, appearing on NBC's Meet the Press, NPR's All Things Considered, and the Fox News Channel, to name a few. And his work has also been featured by outlets such as the New York Times, 538, and the Wall Street Journal. He was an on-air analyst for the PBS NewsHour during election night in 2016, and before that, he worked as an off-air consultant for ABC News on their election night decision desk for 14 years. He first came to Washington, D.C. as an intern in the White House press office, and he still lives in the Capitol today. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Victoria, thank you for having me, and thank you to Ballotpedia for existing.
Yeah, of course. Right off the top, I'd like to know how that internship was at the White House.
It was, let's just say for people who might have seen my photo or seen something else of me, and you might be doing the math in your mind about what president that was for. I'll just say that I was one of the less famous Clinton interns. This was in the fall of 1999. And before that internship and before coming to Washington, I grew up in Oregon, went to undergrad at Vanguard University in Orange County, California. I really wasn't political. My family wasn't particularly political. We weren't talking about politics around the table all the time, but I was interested in journalism, in the media, and I was writing for the school paper. I just didn't really have a real focus until I came to Washington. I had that internship where I got to be right between the White House press office staff and the White House press corps, and that's where I caught the political bug, and I figured out this is what I want to write about. And so it is cliche, but catching the Potomac fever, that's my story, Victoria.
You've had it all your life now, I guess.
Yeah, that's how it is. And that's, 20 plus years later, I had to go back and graduate and then found a job here in Washington and been here for 20 plus years. But I feel really fortunate because even though I didn't know that this was a viable job or occupation growing up, I think I thought I was going to be a sports broadcaster and sports journalism or something, but I really enjoy it. And I feel fortunate to do something that I love to do and find a way to get paid to do it.
We've got a few different storylines I'm hoping to cover today with you. But before we get to that, for our listeners who might not be as familiar with Inside Elections as Ballotpedia, could you tell us a little bit about what Inside Elections does and how you came to work there?
Yeah, Inside Elections provides nonpartisan analysis of congressional races, presidential races, and gubernatorial races. We try to look at what are the most competitive races in the country, look at the candidates, the campaigns, the political climate, the data, election results, polling, and we try to make our best projection about which candidate is going to win, which party is going to be in the majority, and what that could look like for Washington and the Capitol and legislation moving forward. I mentioned that my first job out of college was at CNN, and that was good for a while, and then it wasn't good for a while, which is a longer story than this podcast needs to cover. But my first boss at CNN, her name was Karen Dessauer. She worked for a guy named Stuart Rothenberg years ago, and years before we were working together at CNN. And she knew that he was looking for someone new. She knew that I was looking for something new. She wasn't my boss anymore. She said the two of you should talk. And that's part of how I ended up getting hired at what was called the Rothenberg Political Report. Now, for those of you who are a little bit older, you remember that the Rothenberg Political Report and the Cook Political Report, basically two Washington staples when it comes to election analysis and handicapping in the nonpartisan space. And so I worked with Stu for 13 plus years at the Rothenberg Political Report. And then there was a peaceful transfer of power a few years ago. And we renamed it Inside Elections as we move forward into the next chapter. So Inside Elections is sort of a newer brand, but I definitely had the benefit of building on a legacy that was the Rothenberg Political Report.
On behalf of our elections team, we're really grateful for all the work you do. Now let's get into some of these stories that have been top of mind for Americans this week. We're recording this interview on Wednesday, April 5th, and former President Donald Trump's indictment is one of those top stories. Trump's the first former U.S. president to face criminal charges. He was arraigned in Manhattan on Tuesday, the 4th. He was charged with 34 felony charges for falsifying records to hide payments made to Stephanie Gregory Clifford, also known as Stormy Daniels, before the 2016 election. You, Nathan, have written quite a bit about his legal situation, and I'd love to dig through some of the points you've made. First, now that Trump has turned himself in, we know a little bit more about what comes next, but you don't think anyone can say for certain how things are going to play out. What is making this so unpredictable?
Because we haven't faced this situation before. I mean, the dirty secret about election analysis and projections is that you rely heavily on the past, right? You rely heavily on trends and election results and looking at past cycles and what past cycle might be most applicable to the current cycle. And we have not faced a cycle where a former president is under one set of indictments, potentially more, depending on the outcome of three other investigations that are going on. And so when either trying to do the analysis ourselves or talking with political consultants and strategists, no one really knows. I mean, everyone's trying to get their best, make their best analysis, but no one can really say for certain. One of the things that stood out to me with the current situation with the Manhattan DA was the next in-person appearance being December. I'm like, holy cow, Victoria, that's like 2 months before the Iowa caucuses. And so is President Trump going to be on trial and simultaneously, I'll say a candidate? I know he's announced already, but what does that look like? But we also can't, we're not forgetting that he could come under indictment in Fulton County with the Georgia, with the Georgia case. And then there's two other cases as well that simultaneously could happen. What does that look like? Let's be even more specific. Another thing that I wrote for Roll Call was the media saturation surrounding Trump and his legal problems is only going to continue. Look at what just happened. The media was covering the motorcade to and from the airport. The media was also focused on a set of closed doors at the courthouse for hours. Like, imagine if there's an actual trial. Imagine if there are two trials going on
in the midst of primaries,
how is that going to look? And that is going to be a challenge for congressional candidates to get their message out, right? Or to help voters learn who they are, because there's just going to be so much coverage on the media. And when the media does finally realize that, there's a whole set of Senate and House races with the majorities on the line, probably the first question for Republican candidates will be, are you still with Trump or are you not with Trump? What do you think about that testimony that we just heard today or that piece of evidence? Is this going to be a challenge on multiple different levels? And the down ballot stuff has not really been, I think, discussed a lot up to this point.
Yeah, we're going to get into it in just a moment. But last question on Trump himself. He had a fundraising windfall since his indictment came out in the last week of March. And it's early in this whole election cycle, but what effect do you see this having on his viability as the Republican nominee?
Well, at the risk of this being my last podcast with Ballotpedia, I'll just say that I know Trump talked about, and the campaign talked about how much money they've raised. Until we see the FEC reports or until we see that, I think it's healthy to be a little bit skeptical, right? We don't know for sure. We're just taking what the campaign says. And anytime we do that with any campaign, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But money, I don't think money is Trump's problem politically. Politically, his problem is that he needs to show that he can expand beyond his base. These indictments and what just happened in New York City, it certainly fired up the base, but having your base is not sufficient to getting elected. You have to have your fired up base and you have to win over independent voters. And right now we've had 3 consecutive cycles where independent voters have either chosen Democratic candidates over Republicans in the 2018 and 2022 midterms, or more of them chose Biden over Trump in the 2020 elections. So Republicans and Trump, if they were in the mood for self-reflection, should probably be thinking about, why are we not winning independent voters? Because those are going to be critical to them winning both branches of government, being executive and legislative branches.
Right. Now, returning back to how this is all going to affect down ballot Republicans, you kind of mentioned like they need to break through the noise of the media covering all of this. This will also obviously affect other GOP presidential hopefuls. You recently wrote about the race for relevancy in that GOP hopeful field. What do you mean by that? And what moves from candidates or potential candidates have caught your attention?
Yeah, the race for relevancy is a way, even though we do a lot of quantitative data, it's more of a qualitative idea that you need to be a part of the conversation, right? And Trump is always a part of the conversation these days. I think Governor DeSantis, even though he isn't a candidate, has done a good job of elevating himself into the conversation. People watch everything he says and does. They want to know his reaction to the news of the day. He is relevant as a political candidate, even if you don't like him or not. That's not really what I'm talking about. Nikki Haley, Governor/Ambassador Haley, I think with her announcement did a good job of getting into the conversation and maybe prolonged her relevancy or her time in the national conversation with the idea of a competency test for aging individuals. Because then she had senators making comments about whether they agreed or not. So she was more than just a candidate. And I think we're seeing other candidates who are trying to break in. I expect Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina to announce soon, right? He announced that he just so happens to be dropping by Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, which he's from. So that's fun that that's a part of his tour. But I think that will be an effort to at least get some buzz. But can he maintain that? But tying this back into what we were talking about earlier, the Trump factor, the Trump legal issues are just so engrossing by the media is so engrossed by that it's going to be even harder to break into the national conversation when you have him as a shadow. And I think he's kind of banking on that. He wants to be the center of attention. He likes to be the center of attention, and he has that right now, even though it's not for all good reasons.
And there may be some benefit to the Democrats to keep him in the spotlight, to keep some of these Republican nominees from gaining that relevancy.
Right. I think Democrats, are comfortable with having either Trump on trial or Trump versus DeSantis be the news, particularly at a time when voters are still not completely comfortable with the direction of the country under President Biden's leadership. We've kind of forgotten or people have missed that Biden is actually at his lowest point in the last 2 months in terms of his job approval rating. But the focus isn't on Biden right now. For most folks, it's about Trump.
And you have been on the record saying that you don't believe President Joe Biden will run in 2024. At this point in the cycle, is there a higher likelihood that he may run, in your opinion?
I'm probably going to be wrong about this, Victoria. we don't admit people don't admit mistakes until he actually announces. There is an outside possibility. He is still an unpopular president when it comes to job approval rating. He's still our oldest president in history. He's not getting any younger. So there are question marks there, but Democrats are feeling emboldened, I think, particularly by overperforming in the 2022 midterms. I'd argue that they overperformed in spite of Biden, not because of him, but that lesson is lost. And even if even those Democrats who are a little bit squeamish about moving forward with Biden as a candidate, they ask, who else?
And I was going to ask you that. Who else?
There is not a consensus. The vice president does not have. I'm sure that she would run in the event that the president does not run, but she wouldn't have it sewn up. There'll be a lot of attention on Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. She just told the New York Times, I think it was last week, that she's not going to run under any circumstance. And anytime I hear that from a politician, I just think, well, that would be easy to change if you just say, well, things have changed, and then you would just change your mind. So just because she said that doesn't mean she wouldn't run if Biden doesn't run. So it looks like, I'm prepared to be wrong on my Biden not running again, because everything is moving in that direction, even if there is uncertainty about his strength as an incumbent candidate. Let me add this one. For Democrats who are confident that Biden can beat Trump again, this would be a different election than 2020. In 2020, we had an unpopular sitting president who was Trump, right? That was a huge factor. Now we could have an unpopular incumbent president who is Biden. And that to me, that matters.
Obviously, the crisis of the pandemic has waned, so that's not going to be a factor like it was in 2020.
And it's going to be, likely to be another election focused on the economy. And in 2022, even though Democrats overperformed in the House, even though Republicans won the majority, Democrats expanded the majority in the Senate, the top issue was the economy, and voters who prioritize the economy voted for Republican candidates by an overwhelming margin. So that's something to watch. I still expect abortion access to be an issue again, but the economy will likely be number one.
Bringing things down to the state and local level, there were a few elections that occurred this week that were slightly eclipsed by this Trump news. First, in Chicago, the Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson defeated former chief of Chicago Public Schools Paul Vallis in the race to become the city's next mayor. It was expected to be a tight race, and it certainly was, with 91% of precincts reporting only 16,000 votes are separating the two candidates. So what's the early analysis as to why Chicagoans chose the more progressive candidate out of the two Democratic candidates?
How honest are we being, Victoria? I will leave it to the experts on Chicago to do the deep dive. I will say that I'm old enough to remember when Paul Vallis was running for governor and lost in that Democratic primary almost 2 decades ago. So these folks continued to hang around. Where I think this is applicable for even outside of Chicago is on the issue of crime. Crime and safety is something we're going to continue to hear from the Republican Party to use against the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party, I feel like, still hasn't found a good answer. They've kind of getting pushed into a box in that crime did not just start happening a few years ago. And sadly, there will probably always be violent crime, particularly in our major cities. But Democrats have gotten pushed into a corner in defending themselves and defending potentially unpopular policies that if they don't figure out a way to talk about it and navigate it on a national scale, then candidates for Congress or both the House and the Senate will start to get branded with that soft on crime label that could hurt them in places where crime isn't really an issue, but it's because of that National Democratic Party brand. So that will be on the weight of the new Chicago mayor to try to make some inroads into what is a real crime problem. Education
was another major topic in this race. Do you think that's a topic that applies nationally to the Democrats that they're going to need to play some defense on?
Well, education started to pop up, particularly in the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial race, right? And sort of the uprising of parents and parents' rights and parent involvement in schools. Maybe some of that was muted a little bit in that a year later in 2022, Democrats did better than expected, or better than where it looked like things were headed after Glenn Youngkin's win in that Virginia race. I still expect Republican parents' rights, and particularly on education, to be a key message point for Republicans, particularly under that safety umbrella, right? Keeping you safe, keeping your kids safe. That's something Republicans are going to put in their ads, I expect, in this next cycle.
Turning our attention to the state level, Wisconsin had their state Supreme Court election on Tuesday. Janet Protasiewicz defeated Daniel Kelly in the runoff to fill the vacancy on that court, which was created by Justice Pat Roggensack's retirement. With 95% of precincts reporting, Protasiewicz won 55% of the vote, leading Kelly by more than 200,000 votes. This was the most expensive judicial election in U.S. history, with at least $44 million spent as of the end of last month. The previous record was only $15 million. So why did this judicial race gain so much attention? And I know Inside Elections didn't give a race rating to this because it's not in your scope, but did it turn out as you expected it to?
Well, I liked only 15 million, right? I think you and I would gladly split that 15 million and live a happy life. But it had, first of all, was I surprised? I would say I wasn't necessarily surprised by the outcome, but surprised by the margin. At Inside Elections, we have a metric called baseline, which we try to establish what is the typical partisanship in any particular state or district. And what we do is we take 4 recent cycles worth of election results, all the statewide results, not just federal, but down ballot offices, all the congressional races, and we use a trimmed mean. So it's throw out the high and throw out the low, and then you have an average. So according to that baseline metric, Wisconsin is the most evenly divided state in the country, with just a Democratic, a +1 Democratic advantage. So to see a Democrat win by, we'll see what the final results are, 5+ or even considerably more than 5 points, to me is a surprise, and because that moves that is outside of what I would expect for a Wisconsin race to be. It does have ramifications potentially for congressional races and federal races, within our scope with redistricting. That now I would expect there to be challenges to the maps, both the congressional maps and the state legislative maps, with Democrats hoping to get a more favorable result that would result in a new map to change what is now a 6 Republicans and 2 Democrats in the congressional delegation to something that is closer to even with the partisanship of the state. That's a lot of steps to go through to get to that point. But that's where it has an impact. And it also has a potential impact on policy, particularly on abortion and access to abortion. So that's why there was so much money spent, because it has it's one race, technically a nonpartisan race, that has big potential implications for both parties.
Yeah, just a quick note for our listeners. It went from a 4-3 conservative majority to now a 4-3 liberal majority, and that's how those policy ramifications could play out. Let's turn back to the work of Inside Elections and then look ahead to some future elections. You kind of mentioned at the top of the podcast what you all use for your race ratings, but if you could dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's good. I'm glad we have, I think this is a 3-hour podcast, right?
Yeah. We'll take a short intermission, but...
That's right. Grab some popcorn. So at Inside Elections, for our ratings, it's both qualitative and quantitative analysis, meaning we're not pollsters ourselves, but we try to digest as much polling as possible. Partisan, nonpartisan, public, private. I want to see as much data as possible. We don't put that into a specific formula, but particularly toward the end of the cycle, we are very data driven. It doesn't matter which candidate looks best in their TV ads or which candidate we thought was going to win a year before the election. We're going to follow the data in those weeks leading up to the election and try to make our best projection on both the rating and ultimately which candidate is going to win. And that could be a little bit frustrating for some people that it's not a formula. So if they disagree with the rating, sometimes it's hard to articulate the specific thing, because we're looking at the individual race, but also trying to look at the national political environment. And in presidential races, what is happening at the presidential level, because we've seen that there is a very high correlation between how a district votes for president and how a district votes for the House and how a state votes for the Senate. People say that they're splitting tickets, but few people are actually doing that. So, and since your audience is a little, if I'm allowed to say, probably a little more nerdier than the normal folks, one of the frustrations, I'll let people behind the scenes a little bit, that I stopped asking people, our sources, if they think a race is a toss-up or not. I used to ask that because I want to know, right? They're involved in a race in a particular way, but I have learned that people have different definitions for toss-up, right? To some people, there's either toss-up or there's safe. And so if you say, well, this isn't a toss-up, then they say, oh, well, you think there's no chance. Like, no, actually, we have 9 ratings categories that we can put these races in. There could be tilt, it could be lean, it could be likely. And so I guess I would encourage the folks that are listening, to think about, well, when you say toss-up, what does that mean to you? Because both us and the Cook folks and I know you've had Kyle from Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball we do have these multiple rating categories, and we're trying to measure what is the likelihood of something happening. Even if something's in lean Republican, that doesn't mean that a Democrat can't win. It just means that the Republican is more likely to win, and we have to embrace the uncertainty that comes with these ratings. And I'll just add that, I mean, we do our ratings and they tend to get the most attention, but we're also, sometimes that's not even, I think, the most important thing that we're doing. I mean, we're doing deep dives. We're getting bio on the candidates some of these candidates are going to be future lawmakers for the country. And so there's all sorts of things that we do that don't get nearly as much attention, but Aaron Covey on our team and Jacob Rubashkin on our team are doing these, tremendous deep dives in races before people even start caring about them.
It's very interesting to hear that it's not formulaic. I would have thought, since you're using partisan or nonpartisan polls, that you would weigh those differently. But is it just more of a consensus that you all come to when you?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I mean, when we're doing our ratings, we'll try to gather all the data, and then we'll just have extensive conversations and say, okay, where do we feel? It's more than that. I mean, it's data driven, but what is the best and most accurate rating category for this particular race? And that's why you don't see us have a specific percentage chance and say, oh, Republicans have a 80% chance of holding the House, or Republicans have a 40% chance of winning back the Senate, because I feel like if we were to put those percentages on it, that would lead people to believe that we're running an actual model, like a 538 that would produce a specific percentage.
Well, Inside Elections just released their 2024 House race ratings, and early in the game, battleground districts are evenly split, with each party defending 33 vulnerable seats. You wrote that Republicans narrowed 222, 213 majority means that there's a good deal of uncertainty about who's going to be controlling the House in 2025. So can you talk to us about why that's the case?
Yeah, well, first on the 33 in terms of vulnerable seats, that was not intentional. We don't, even though we're nonpartisan, that doesn't mean the battlegrounds have to be even. And just look at the Senate battleground, where we have no vulnerable Republican Senate seats, and all the vulnerability is on the Democratic side. Democrats only need a net gain of 5, but there is uncertainty with the maps in North Carolina and Ohio. The state speaker of the House in North Carolina just said yesterday or today that they're likely to take up redistricting this summer. And if Republicans do what they want, they could pick up a handful of seats in North Carolina alone and effectively bump that number up for Democrats in terms of what they need. The technical number will still be 5, but when you talk about sort of functionally, if there are a bunch of solid Democratic seats that are now likely to go Republican, that will increase the threshold of what Republicans need. Overall, Victoria, this cycle on the House side feels like it's slower in coming together. I mean, slower in challengers announcing to incumbent races. I think the parties largely agree on what the competitive races are going to be, but there hasn't been a flood of candidates yet. And I know we're still in April, but if there were a lot of candidates itching to run, then I think we would see more. And maybe some of it is with the uncertainty at the presidential level and not really knowing who's going to be at the top of the ticket and what the political environment looks like before putting the candidates want to know a little bit more before putting their house and their family on hold to run for office.
Right. My next question was, do you foresee any of those toss-ups moving in either directions once we head into primary season? But I guess if there's not a whole lot of candidates right now entering races, it's tough to tell.
Yeah, we have to see where the cycle leads us. I will say that the toss-up category was one of the surprises of 2022, that when we looked at the toss-up races and you looked at independent voters, I expected Republicans to win a majority of independent voters and to win a majority of our toss-up races. And that was reflected in our overall projection for the House. When it came down to it, nationally, independent voters supported Democratic candidates by a narrow margin, and Democrats won the vast majority of our toss-up races. And so the overall +9 for Republicans ended up being lower than the floor of our range, which was 12 seats. So that's going to make me concerned for the next year and a half in terms of trying to identify what the toss-up races or how the toss-up races are going to perform moving forward. There will be some movement within the races. I don't expect it to be dramatic unless something dramatic happens. For example, if there's a toss-up race and no credible challenger really appears, then you could see it fall off. Or if something happens at the top of the ticket where either the Democratic or Republican nominee just implodes, then you could see a lot of shifts in a large number of races. Absent, if we continue headed on a close and competitive presidential race, the fluctuation in the House will probably just be a category or two and not a broad sweeping movement of seats in one direction.
Let's turn our attention to the present year, where we have 3 gubernatorial elections in 2023 in Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Let's start first with Kentucky. Inside Elections has rated the race as a toss-up. So what is factoring into Democratic Governor Andy Beshear's tough re-election bid?
He barely won his initial race, and Kentucky is a very Republican state. And he doesn't have the opportunity to run against as unpopular of a candidate as what Matt Bevin was last time around. That primary is still coming up. We'll see who ends up being the nominee. The Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, is at least a top-tier candidate, if not the front runner. But Kelly Craft, former ambassador, has been coming on. She has the most money. She's been airing more ads, although she hasn't really just dominated the airwaves like what we expected based on her personal wealth. But I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure that it matters, meaning I'm not sure that any of the Republicans have the same baggage as what Bevin was carrying previously. And so Beshear, it's not something specific that he's done. It's just that he remains a Democratic governor in a Republican state.
Yeah, that primary will take place on May 16th, so we'll have a better idea about that time, what the race will look like. Over in Louisiana, Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards is term limited. Inside Elections has rated that race lean Republican, so probably has a similar answer, but what are the factors there?
Yeah, so since Edwards can't run for re-election, Edwards proved that a Democrat can win under certain conditions, but now that he's not running, Republicans have a great chance of sort of pulling that governorship back into alignment with the partisanship of the state. That race is going to take place because of the late Louisiana jungle primary. I mean, it's going to develop very late, but Republicans would have to really go out of their way to lose. I think it's the best way, which Republicans have shown they can do it. Sometimes they can take races they're supposed to win and find a way to screw it up. But I would expect Republicans to win when it all shakes out.
Finally, this last question is a fun one. Inside Elections recently wrote a series about nepotism babies in politics. Nepo babies is a term that's pretty broadly used these days in Hollywood to describe actors, musicians, models, who also have famous actor, musician, model parents. So who are some of the highest profile political Nepo babies?
I got to give credit to my colleague Jacob Rubashkin for really doing the deep dive, and you should check out his pieces on InsideElections.com because it's got the photos, and it's remarkable that how similar some of them look to their family predecessors. For example, in Georgia, former now Congressman Mike Collins and his father Mac Collins, who used to be in Congress, are two of the big The resemblance is striking. It's almost as if they were related, Victoria, almost as if they were related. One of the bigger one is probably Bob Menendez, the New Jersey senator, and now his son, Rob Menendez, who is serving in the House. There's a potential for this dynamic that is not in place yet, but if former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, when she decides not to run for re-election, her daughter is viewed as a potential candidate running there. So that would be a high profile example of this, but it's a fun walk down memory lane, and probably some names that even political junkies are like, oh my goodness, like that. I had forgotten or did not remember that.
Yeah. Just to wrap up that groundbreaking analysis you all did, there were 11 sitting House members who followed their parents to Congress, one sitting senator, Lisa Murkowski, who followed in her father's footsteps, and then 4 other senators had parents with other political backgrounds like U.S. representatives and governors. So very interesting stuff.
And and even as you get to the end of both, there's a House piece and a companion Senate piece, and I'll tease maybe a companion gubernatorial piece to round out the trilogy coming up soon. But even those that don't have a direct family member connection, there's still a lot of political connections that aren't directly related. That it feeds into my kind of longstanding theory. There aren't a lot of normal people that run for Congress, and in part because it's hard. I mean, it's if you don't have personal money or access to a fundraising network or to a political network, it's hard just to go from the sort of from nothing, from ground zero to getting elected. It takes a lot of work, and it helps if you have if you're connected in a family way.
Makes sense. Well, thank you for coming on today and sharing your insight with us. And for our listeners, you can check out more of Inside Elections' work and learn more about some of the stories we chatted about by clicking the link in our show notes. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a review. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.